Okay, I think we're live. All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this workshop on youth migration and our shared future. My name is Amira, and I'm co facilitating today with my colleague Danielle. Quick introductions. We both work in IOM's office to the UN. So it's the liaison office to the UN headquarters in New York. Um, my areas of work are largely under the Sustainable Development Agenda, including gender and youth issues.
So, hi everyone, I'm Danielle and I work with Amira in the Sustainable Development Team at IOM UN.
Perfect. All right, so here's a small roadmap on what we will be doing today. Um, Hold on. There we go. Thank you. First, we'll talk a little bit about IOM and what is it that we do, and then look a little bit into the UN and focusing more on the Summit of the Future. Then we'll have an overview of youth and migration. After that, we will go into a policy workshop, which includes an individual work session, and then we all come back together for a debrief. And at the very end of this workshop, you will have a resource package as well as a feedback form. So let's begin with an introduction to IOM, the UN, and the Summit of the Future. First, we have a video which provides a quick look on how migration is featured in the Sustainable Development Goals.
At the midway point of the 2030 Agenda, the world faces a crossroads. A confluence of crises has dealt a major blow to Sustainable Development Goals implementation efforts. At the same time, human mobility around the world is increasingly complex, driven and impacted by major global transformations. These risk leaving hundreds of millions of international migrants, internal migrants, and displaced persons behind. This is 1 in every 8 people in the world. We know much more than we used to about what human mobility is and what its impacts are. Migration contributes to poverty reduction, increased innovation and entrepreneurship, and investment in businesses and human capital. Remittances finance sustainable development. In 2022, remittances to developing countries reached 626 billion USD. They are the largest source of external finance flows to low and middle income countries other than China. Migration supports innovation and entrepreneurship. 36% of high-tech companies are founded by migrants, including Google, eBay, and Intel. Safe and regular migration pathways are central to growth and prosperity. A recent study showed that every additional 1% of immigration can boost GDP growth in destination countries by 2%. However, these benefits are not guaranteed, and the contributions that migrants and displaced populations can make to society continue to be hindered in multiple ways. Migration remains unsafe. Migrant workers around the world are often hired for dangerous work and have limited access to social protection or health care. Digital inequalities hold migrants' entrepreneurship back. 60 million refugees and IDPs do not have reliable internet and mobile connectivity. These negative outcomes are avoidable. Managed well, human mobility can be a cornerstone of sustainable development, prosperity, and progress, and can be a central element of the rescue plan for the SDGs. People on the move are part of the solution. We need bold transformation. We must act now.
All right. So, who are we? So, IOM was established in 1951 and we became a related UN entity in 2016. IOM is part of the UN system as the leading intergovernmental organization promoting humane and orderly migration for the benefit of all. There is no one agreed upon definition on who is a migrant. IOM sees a migrant as any person who is moving or has moved across an international border or within a state away from his or her habitual place of residence, regardless of the person's legal status, whether the movement is voluntary or involuntary, and the causes of the movement. So as you can see, it's a very broad definition, but it also allows us to assist a lot of people. There are 4 areas that we work on in particular, which are here on the slide. We work to ensure that migration is managed in an orderly and safe way so that we can promote international cooperation on migration issues. We also assist in the search for practical solutions to migration challenges and provide humanitarian assistance to migrants in need, including refugees and internally displaced people. Our footprint, there are 281 million migrants in the world, which equals to around 3.6% of the world population. So this means that 1 in 30 people is a migrant. We have presence in 171 countries. We have 175 member states and over 21,000 staff worldwide. The next 2 slides give a light overview of migration and sustainable development goals, as well as the UN's upcoming summit of the future. So the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are defined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this goes back to 2015 when it was adopted by all UN member states. The idea there is to provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. So the home, quote unquote, for migration in the SDGs is under SDG 10, which is on reduce inequalities. And like you can see on the screen, we have highlighted SDG 10.7, which is to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people. This can be done in many ways, including through implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. While migration intersects with a lot of the other SDGs, sometimes people ask, well, why was it placed in under SDG 10? One way to address that is to think about it that migration here is looked at through a holistic lens. And then inequalities, given one example, for example, is that young migrants often face multiple forms of inequalities, including being double marginalized for their migratory status and for being a young person. Other factors can, of course, further the inequalities faced depending on context. So here factors like gender come to play as well. So we just looked very briefly at one key element of the UN, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Another UN flagship initiative is the Summit of the Future. So the idea here is to work out the quote-unquote how to the what. So for example, we already have the what in the form of many existing agreements and commitments, starting with the UN Charter and including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 2030 Agenda. Now this summit will be looking at the how. How do we cooperate better to deliver on the aspiration and goals of the UN? How do we better meet the needs of the present while also preparing for the challenges of the future? So the summit itself, it will take place in September of this year in New York at the UN headquarters. The idea there is to build international consensus and restore trust in multilateralism. The outcome of the summit is the intergovernmentally agreed on pact for the future. And the pact, as you can see on the screen, has 5 chapters. There's also 2 annexes to it, but here I want to focus a little bit more on chapter 4, which is on youth and future generations. So what does it mean to have a chapter in the pact for the future on youth? Like, what's the tangible outcome of this? One short answer is to think of it as institutionalizing meaningful youth engagement and inclusion. So still dissecting this a little bit further, what does that then mean is looking at and addressing in this chapter multiple elements, and I'll just mention a couple. One is international standards on meaningful youth engagement, funding and resource related issues, youth in decision making, expanding pathways when it comes to skills development and education, and then a little bit different but very important in order to measure that we make progress and don't just talk about these things, is monitoring and evaluation for effectiveness, and then transparency at the UN as well. So these are all areas that young people have been telling the UN to pay attention to. In a minute, we'll look a little bit about at what kind of mechanisms there are for young people to have their voice heard. But these are themes that have repeatedly come up, and they have now been heard and worked into this chapter 4 of the pact. So, like I just mentioned, some of the ways in which young people's voice has been heard is through UN mechanisms or initiatives. So the UN Youth Strategy was launched in 2018, and they have a whole website with a lot of resources as well as progress reports. So that's another important aspect, again, to track and monitor how we're doing and where the gaps are and where we're falling behind, so that we don't leave no one behind. So the UN has been taking steps to empower youth and enhance their role in decision-making processes at the UN and at the multilateral system. So one big example is that last year, 2023, for the first time ever, there was a ASG, so Assistant Secretary General, appointed for youth affairs. So now there is a new UN Youth Office that is headed by an Assistant Secretary General who's also a young person. And they're driving a lot of the youth agenda within the UN. Then there's UN Youth Delegates programs. These are often country-tied, so that comes down to the member states to see how they are able to, for example, send delegates to New York and have their young people advocate for their country's issues in different UN bodies like the committees. Then there's many different youth consultations and organizations and advisory boards. And again, the resource package in the end has some more information on different ways to engage. So at this point, we will open Mentimeter for a very short youth and migration trivia. It has 3 questions. You can get to it by scanning the QR code on the screen. So the first 2 are multiple choice questions, and then the last one is open-ended, and we will come back to the open-ended one later in this workshop. So yes, let's go. All right, so here you'll be able to vote on this. What is the UN definition of youth as it's defined in the UN Youth Strategy? Let me see. Okay, so we have one answer for the. Okay, a little bit more answers. I'll give it a moment. Sometimes with the keywords, it can take a minute. Okay. All right. So the correct answer here is 18 to 24. All right. Then, how many young migrants are there in the world? Okay. I think we can give it another 15 seconds. All right. And the right answer for this one is 32 million. So 32 young migrants in the world. Now, this is a little bit more not complicated, but this is an open-ended question. So, what challenges do young migrants face? It can be anything that comes to mind, and you can submit multiple responses too. And to get on the Mentimeter, you can either go back to the QR code that was shown in the first slide, or you can go to menti.com and use the code from the top that's shown at the top of the screen. Okay, so one response so far, which is language. Okay, so we can, okay, language barriers and cultural shocks. Yeah. Okay, so there we go. Discriminatory issues, primarily in terms of race and or ethnicity. Difficulty in communicating can hinder educational progress, social integration, and access to services. Displacement and language barrier, cultural shock. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for those responses. I can see that there's a lot of overlap, which speaks to the how often and frequently these challenges are faced. Thank you. All right. So at this point, now that we've looked briefly at what IOM and the UN do and does, as well as defined some of the key terminology, let's turn to look at youth and migration. So I'll hand over to Danielle for this section.
Okay, hi everyone. So now let's start by defining youth. So at IOM, youth is defined as persons between ages 15 and 24. However, there's no universally agreed upon definition of youth. The UN and the UN Youth Strategy actually define youth as those aged 18 to 24, while other entities include persons up to the age of 35 as youth. So we know that there are 281 million migrants. Young migrants account for approximately 11.3% of the total migrant population, which is 32 million, which we have seen in our Menti earlier. And if we count children in as well, that number increases to 21% or approximately 59 million. Migration will continue to be a lived experience for a growing number of people, particularly for young people, and it is often driven by complex and intersectional factors. So, this figure shows the share of young migrants per region, and Africa is leading at 16%, and Latin American, Caribbean, and Oceania are close second. So these are 8 common drivers of youth migration. So young people move to find better job opportunities, to find better education and skill development. There's also climate induced migration. And a lot of young people also move or migrate to flee persecution, violent conflict, to seek asylum, and to reunite with their family members. I'm certain that you can think of many more drivers of youth migration, and that some of these may be very personal to you. So our next slide is going to highlight why it's important to promote safe, orderly, and regular migration of young people. The benefits of well-managed migration are tremendous. Well-managed migration can accelerate the implementation of the SDGs by enabling a lot of things, including climate change adaptation, filling labor shortages, providing safety to those fleeing conflict, and facilitating alternatives to irregular migration journeys, which are often exploitative and dangerous. So, in order to fully harness or take advantage of the benefits of migration while supporting the world's most vulnerable communities or individuals at the same time, IOM promotes the increase and enhancement of regular migration pathways. So, very briefly, what are regular migration pathways? So, regular migration pathways enable people to move, enter, and stay in a given state in ways that are authorized by the law of that state and international agreements to which it is a party. So, examples of migration pathways include documentation, visa systems, just health and social services, and skills training for people on the move. So now we get to the most fun part of today's session, which is the policy workshop. Before we begin, please open the policy worksheet that we will be using for this part of the presentation. You can find it by scanning the QR code on the screen. And you'll see that it's a Word document, so you can either download it on your computer or phone and save that copy, work on it directly, or you can use it as a reference and write your responses. Just take notes using your pen or paper. Mm. Okay. So, what are we doing in the policy workshop? So, first, we'll give you a brief introduction on the workshop, including our goal for today. And then we'll go through the worksheet together. And then we'll also be providing guiding questions that you can use to frame and think through your ideas. Second, we'll give you about 10 minutes to work on the policy worksheet individually. Then, once that's done, you'll be given the chance to share your 3 actionable recommendations with the wider group using the same Menti link that we have used previously before. And after that, we'll do a debrief together. So before we proceed, just a quick reminder to please have the worksheet opened. The QR code is on the slide again if you didn't catch it on the previous one. So, what is our goal for today? So, our goal is to create a better future for young migrants. And we'll do this through a streamlined policy exercise. So, on the screen, you'll see the policy worksheet, and you can also download it with the same QR code that's on the screen. So, the policy making process is often complex and long, and it involves a lot of different steps, including agenda setting, formulation, adoption, implementation, and evaluation. So, in our workshop today, we'll be focusing on the early stages of the process. So now let's turn to our policy worksheet. So please bear with me. It might seem long and technical, but I'm sure it should help you in working through the worksheet. So first, the first box on the worksheet, you're going to identify a target community. And circling back to our goal to create a better future for young migrants, you can either choose young migrants as a whole, or you can identify communities of young migrants, for example, young migrant workers or international students. Second, you're going to identify a specific issue within your target community that you would like to focus on today. So here you can draw from your answers on Menti earlier on the challenges that young migrants face. And so if I'm remembering correctly, a lot of you said that language barriers, like cultural shocks, and all that were very important challenges that young migrants usually face. So after identifying your target community and issues, now we get to the third box on the worksheet, which is drafting our recommendations. So, what is an actionable recommendation? An actionable recommendation is simply like your suggestion on how to solve or address the issues you identified. I know this all sounds very technical, but these are meant to guide you to frame your ideas. So in the worksheet, we have provided a simple, commonly used guideline in drafting recommendations. So you should aim for your recommendations to be SMART, meaning specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And then the fourth box on the worksheets, after drafting your actionable recommendations, next you're going to think about which organization, agency, entity, or individual is best suited to implement your recommendations. For example, you might want to address your government leaders, the head of a UN entity, or someone closer to you, like your teacher or professor. So for this exercise, please choose one target audience. And finally, the last box on our worksheet, you're going to draft a strategy to ensure that your recommendations reach your target audience. So this can sound daunting, but there are many different ways you can do this, including forming coalitions or partnerships with individuals or organizations with similar interests to amplify your voices. You can also utilize existing mechanisms such as participating in youth consultations or youth advisory boards. You can also start a campaign on social media or simply just reach out to an official or an expert in your target organization or field. At this point, please let us know in the chat box if you have any questions. Um, in the next slide, we have prepared an example of the worksheet. So here, our target community is international students, and our issue is access to affordable and quality healthcare in their country of study. So we drafted one actionable recommendation, which is to start a petition on campus seeking commitments from university administration to provide or assist international students in seeking affordable healthcare within the next school year. So in this case, our target or audience is the university administration. And in order for our recommendation to reach or encourage the university administration, we are going to partner with student organizations or other international students to advocate for affordable and quality healthcare for international students. So now I'm going to hand over to Amira for the next part of the workshop.
All right. So thank you, Danielle. Um, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat. And then I also know that the moderators kindly dropped the link to the doc there, as well as an instruction again, just that you can either download the document and work on it on your laptop or phone or whatever device you're using to access, or you can just have it as a reference and use pen and paper to do it. So whatever you prefer. We'll also be monitoring the chat during that time in case any questions come up, and then we will come back to the debrief after that. So we'll start 10-minute timer. We'll play some acoustic music in the background, and then we'll reconvene in around it will be around 10 minutes from now. Good luck. See you soon. All right. Hi, everybody. Um, Great. So now we get back together for the next part, which is the recommendations and debrief. I'll also address some of the questions that came up in the chat. Um, Actually, let me do that first before we then go to the debrief. There is a way to submit general feedback, and you can even plug your answers to the feedback form. Or right now you will see in the chat box our email addresses. You can also email us the file if you would like. But it's not mandatory, but of course we encourage it. Then there was a question or a couple of questions around, at the end of the day, and I think it's a very valid question, and thank you for raising it. Like, what to do if the officials don't listen? So how can young folks advocate for policy change and such if, there isn't somebody who is very receptive? I mean, first, I just want to say there can be a very big difference in how much there is a space for like civic or political engagement. Country to country differs, era to era differs as well. So, what to do in this instance? Um, I can't say that there is any official, and by no means is this what I'm about to say, any official guidance. It's more like from working in the youth space and advocacy space. I would say that always prioritize your safety, because at the end of the day, it comes down to us as individuals to assess the situation and the scope of, how much we can engage in a safe manner. So that's always a first concern. The second option is, of course, to join or link up with others on like social media if that is accessible. It's a tool to connect with other organizers and build solidarity, and then have allies advocate for issues that, are of common interest, for example. And then, if it is possible, again, using any of the more official pathways, because sometimes it might look like completely inaccessible, but then sometimes you'd be surprised how much there could be a chance for a dialogue, or for at least submitting some recommendations. And this is also why this policy workshop is tailored around that, as an exercise in exactly doing that. And then also, I'll say, like, migration, like we saw earlier, is rooted in SDG 10.7 on under reducing inequalities. And there, again, if we look at the entry points, it's reducing inequalities. So one thing that I have personally found helpful in advocacy efforts, especially when it comes to meaningful engagement of young people, is to take a very human rights centered approach and acknowledge that young people shouldn't be just the leaders of tomorrow, but of today already, and kind of build dialogue and say, it's not to, cut one generation out so we can empower another, but to build that type of intergenerational equity and learning and sharing and, growth, where slowly by slowly then we might be able to change some of the structures. Again, it might sound very idealistic depending on the context, and some contexts are extremely difficult, but those are just some thoughts that came to me as I was thinking. And then somebody was asking that it's past midnight, lights out. Can they access this later? The answer is yes. You can come back to the recording anytime and do the exercise. The links will stay up. And if you have any issues, you can also, take our contact details and reach out for information, or if you want to follow up on anything. So we are here, both Danielle and I, to connect and build together. So now let's get back together for the recommendations. There's another Menti. Please open Menti and input your recommendations. So yeah, you scan the QR code or go to menti.com and enter that code in. There's going to be a limit on how much text can be inputted, but at the end there's a form, like the feedback form has a section where you can share your ideas and suggestions and thoughts. And one promise that we will make for you today is that we will be forwarding these recommendations to the director of IOM UN office here in New York. The person who is the director is part of our executive office. So we will compile the recommendations, the actionable recommendations that you put together, and we will put them into a form and we'll hand them over as an outcome of our work here today. So let's see Menti. So here you can type in your responses. So somebody also, while you're typing it up, and we only have 5 minutes left, so just to reply to the question around there's one new one about how to actively take part in our development if there's a difficulty to convince legal entities and such. I try to answer all of those by giving some ideas and recommendations, and how to work within the system, how to build cross-sectoral solidarity, international solidarity, and what could be some entry points in coming forward with your own suggestions. Because if we go forward and say, okay, there's a problem that looks like this, and I want you to fix it, but often if we go in and we're saying, here's a solution to the problem based on my idea, my thought that is backed by evidence, now you're automatically presenting a solution that, hopefully can be valued and taken into consideration. So here we have, okay, so preparing trainings about job searching and helping to apply for jobs, searching for organization which works on the migrant issues support and link with companies, reaching out community leaders. Very good. Developing language training programs, establish cultural orientation workshops, provide academic support service. Very good. Help young migrants get more information about safe migration. See, these are already very solid, actionable recommendations. And, if we had more time, we could then do another session on how to take these forward. But hopefully this kind of sets the framework on how to do kind of policy advocacy on meaningful youth engagement. Okay, so basically we've come to the very last part. And then before we part ways, one last time, we ask you to scan the QR code to access the research package, the feedback form, and instructions on how to stay in touch. Just to quickly say, like in the feedback form, the questions are for you to submit your actual recommendations, and it asks some basic stats, and then you can share anything else that comes to mind. And we have one more slide, which is a brief video. But before we do that, we would really like to thank you for your participation today. And hopefully it's very brief, but hopefully the workshop helps you in thinking through policy development around meaningful youth engagement and development. In particular, we hope that this session enables you to advocate for creating a better future for young migrants, rooted in lived experiences because we believe that youth have a strong voice in creating a better future for all.